morning. Welcome back to those of you who've been with us all week at this series, which is based on our Orbis spring edition, where we have the authors from articles that pertain to political warfare by China. And for those of you who don't know me yet, I'm Raleigh Flint, the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. FPRI is a nonpartisan think tank. We've been around since the 1950s, and we're based in Philadelphia, and we're a registered 501c3. Today, we're gonna, earlier this week, we've talked about China vis-a-vis Taiwan and Hong Kong. Yesterday, we talked about China's influence in Africa and Eurasia. And today, we're going to pivot back to East Asia. And we have June Tufel-Dreyer and Toshi Yashihara with us today. And of course, we have our host, Jacques deLisle. Jacques is a stranger to none of you, I think. He's our Asia Program Director. He's also the Stephen A. Cousin Professor of Law, Professor of Political Science, and Director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. Jacques' most recent book, To Get Rich is Glorious, Challenges Facing China's Economic Reform and Opening at 40, he co-edited with Avery Goldstein. And his next book, which is going to be co-edited with one of our speakers today, June Tufel-Dreyer, on Taiwan under Tsai, is forthcoming in 2020. Jacques is regularly an expert witness on issues of China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan law and government policies. Before I turn the program over to Jacques, I also want to mention that if you missed yesterday or Monday's program, all of the videos are going to be on FPRI's YouTube channel. I think they're there already. So please take advantage of that if you missed it, or if, like me, you'd like to watch them again. We also would like to thank our members and our supporters, without whom we could not do this. And our timing could not have been better in terms of discussing China this week. And if you're watching the glib headlines on TV or listening to them on the radio, you will realize that this is where you get the story behind the story. And if you value that, please consider becoming a member if you're not a member already. And if you add just a little bit to your membership, you will get Orbis for free as part of that membership, and you'll be able to read these great articles. So we thank our sponsors and thank our members-to-be. A few housekeeping matters before I turn it over to Jacques. If you go to the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat button. If you'd like to ask a question, put your question in the chat. If you click on that button, a column will appear on the right side of your screen, and you can write a question in there. And we will have the first part of the program, where there's a moderated discussion with Jacques, we will turn to Q&A. So do put your questions in there. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jacques.
Thank you, Raleigh, and thank you all for joining us. And a special thanks to our two speakers today, June Tufel-Dreyer and Toshi Yashihara. This is, as Raleigh said, the third in our installment of 4 sessions featuring contributors to the spring 2020 special issue of Orbis, focusing on political warfare to and mostly from and within East Asia, particularly on China's efforts. Our guests today don't need a lot of introduction, but I'll give one anyway. We've got today's session and tomorrow's session, which will be our wrap-up one. But today we have June Tufel-Dreyer, who's professor of political science at the University of Miami and a senior fellow in the Asia program at FPRI. She writes widely on many of the issues that we're discussing today. Perhaps her most directly relevant book is Middle Kingdom and Empire, the Rising Sun, Sino-Japanese Relations, a long historical perspective. She's also the author of many editions of China's political system and writes widely on China-Japan relations, on Chinese politics, and on Taiwan questions as well. As Raleigh mentioned, she's my co-editor on a forthcoming volume that is rooted back in a program that FPRI did with Brookings Institution a few years ago, but is now updated through the present. Our other speaker today is Toshi Yoshihara, who's a senior fellow at the Center for Strategy and Budgetary Assessment. He also held the Van Buren Chair in Asia Pacific Studies at the Naval War College, has been a visiting professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts, and also writes widely on extremely germane topics for today, including a book on China's information warfare and the book Red Star Over the Pacific, China's Rise and Challenge to the United States. So a lot of stuff there. I'll just do a little bit of framing here, which is familiar to our regular listeners, just about what political warfare is. And I think today's speakers in particular really do focus very much on the political warfare and sharp power questions, that is, attempts to influence the domestic politics of other states, particularly but not limited to their policies toward China. So to quote George Kennan, political warfare is the logical application of Clausewitz's doctrine, that is a continuation of politics through other means, in time of peace, and takes in all means of the national objective pursuit, short of war, including overt and covert uses of the full toolkit of diplomacy, politics, economics, information measures, and so on, to effect, and this is one of the modern formulations, to effect policy decision-making or the political context of policy decision-making in other countries through means that are neither coercive nor limited to persuasion or transaction. Obviously, this overlaps with sharp power, which Christopher Walker notably defines as piercing, penetrating, or perforating the political, media, and social environments of targeted states. So that's not a bad thumbnail sketch of what you both cover in your articles about what China is up to, generally in its outbound efforts, which Toshi writes about in his book, his article on the United Front tactics, and which June addresses in her article on China's targeting Japan. So let's start with a fairly big question here, which I'll throw first to Toshi, which is, how do you define China's political warfare? What is the united front work that is often described, or often the term that's seen as, if not coterminous with at least very much what China uses to pursue political warfare? So Toshi, let me throw it to you. Just give us an overview of how we should understand China's political warfare and united front work.
Sure, absolutely. What I'd like to do is firstly just thank Jacques and Raleigh for having me here to talk about my piece in Orbis. To return to Jacques' question, the purpose of my article really is to try to understand political warfare through the eyes of the Chinese Communist Party. And so what I did for the article was to go through the open source Chinese literature, and particularly looking at the CCP's own writings about political warfare as a way for the reader to kind of step into the shoes of the CCP, to kind of engage in a red team exercise, to understand political warfare as a phenomenon through the CCP, and thereby allowing us to understand the CCP's worldview and the way it thinks about political warfare. And what's interesting is if you read the Chinese literature, the CCP does not call what it does political warfare. It has its own terms. It sort of inhabits its own universe of assumptions and concepts and terms. And the term of art here is united front. And I think that's really the starting point for understanding Chinese political warfare. And I would divide united front into sort of three ways. The first is to think about united front as a concept. And it really is a Leninist concept that calls for a party that's trying to seize power, to form marriages or alliances of convenience with friends and enemies alike as a way to stay in power and ultimately to come to power. And by choosing these friends and alliances of convenience, the party seeking to come to power very deliberately chooses winners and losers. And by doing so, United Front seeks to drive wedges between and among social groups within a society to fracture societal cohesion so that the Communist Party can come to power. And the CCP bought onto this in its earliest years. So it is a Leninist concept. The second way of thinking about United Front is what the CCP calls United Front work, which is really at the center of my piece, which is looking at the intersection of what the CCP wants, its objectives, and the instruments or the means that the CCP uses to get what it wants. So in some ways, it fits the classic definition of strategy, right? Which is the interrelationship between ends and means. And what United Front work seeks to do is to co-opt, manipulate, rally, and control various constituents within China and outside of China that do not belong to the CCP, and to get them to support the party's objectives. And then the third way of thinking about United Front is to thinking about it as institutions, because you need bureaucracies to actually implement United Front work. And what's interesting here is that there are formal United Front organizations like the United Front Work Department that's sole job is to do United Front work. But I think what's even more interesting is that there are other state organs as well as military bodies that also engage in United Front-like work, even though they're not part of the United Front network. And so part of the challenge for outside observers like me is really to try to unravel, to unpack the very complex interlocking network of relationships among these institutions that do United Front work. So again, just to summarize, I think we can understand Chinese political warfare through United Front from a conceptual perspective, from a strategy perspective, as well as an institutional perspective.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a terrific overview of a complex system and set of institutions. I urge all of you to go look at the article. It really does go through and lay this out in detail, and it's impressively sourced in Chinese documents. It sort of has had red team. Let them tell you what they're up to. So June, you come at this issue from a somewhat different perspective, focused on efforts to target Japan. What would you add to that, or what do you see as the particular manifestations of United Front work in the way China's conceived of dealing with Japan?
Well, I see political warfare as encompassing everything short of actual kinetic warfare. And so that includes what the Chinese call the three warfares, which is media warfare, public opinion warfare, and lawfare, legal warfare. And that can be either soft power or sharp power, or things that are patently illegal but which get done anyway. And this has been going on since the beginning. And what is remarkable about Japan is how well Japan has managed to counter and resist this. It hasn't been perfect, but it's done a lot better than the other democracies, such as the United States and Great Britain, and particularly Australia, New Zealand. And in the beginning, what Japan's motive was, it wants to do two things at the same time that are not very easy to do at the same time. One of them being placate a large and geographically close neighbor with whom it wants to trade, while at the same time guarding against the export of communism to the Japanese system. And there was extreme suspicion on both sides. And initially, this took the form of even distrusting the repatriated Japanese. That is, that there were actually 1.5 million Japanese in China at the end of World War II. And obviously the Japanese government wants to get them back and get them back safely. But once having done so, they're regarded with extreme suspicion. They're actually put in quarantine. And the face-saving thing here is that indeed many of them did suffer from vermin. And so there was that. But the real reason was to see whether they had been brainwashed. Now, the Japanese big business was always very, very eager to participate in the Chinese market. Initially, this wasn't a huge deal because the Chinese market was so poor, particularly after the Great Leap Forward and so on. But as China emerged from the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, which is actually precedes Deng Xiaoping, even though he gets credit for most of it, they begin to press. And this is exacerbated by the fact that the United States is giving Japan grief over the big trade imbalance. So they hope to use that. And now at the beginning, China tried very hard to work through the Japanese left wing, Sohyo, the Japanese Federation of Labor Unions, and the Japanese Communist Party. But this didn't really work very well because the left-wing sentiment faded in Japan as the economic miracle worked its way through. And also the Japanese Communist Party had a horrendous split with the Chinese Communist Party during the Cultural Revolution. And although it gets mildly soothed over about 15 years later, they're still not very friendly. So what does the Communist Party do now? It works through the capitalists, and that's been very successful. Another issue they were able to make use of was the nuclear issue. And I wouldn't want to say that's gone, particularly after 3/11, but after 3/11, it's mostly been concentrated on domestic nuclear power plants and not the dropping of bombs. So now the Japanese business community reasons this way: we help China industrialize, and at the same time we help Japan because it helps our business interests. And as time went on, they discover, as did people in the United States, that China is not becoming more friendly and in fact is competing with Japan, and not always on a level playing field. It's stealing Japanese technology and not paying for it and things like that. Now, not surprisingly, the first glimmers of concern come from right of center Japanese groups. There's and one of the issues that it concerns, oh, actually there are a couple of them, but one of them is Okinawa. And there are various hints, sometimes awfully explicit, in the Chinese press and among Chinese officials that Okinawa isn't really part of Japan and that it shouldn't be. And this is very clever because it plays on anti-Japanese sentiment in Okinawa and also among people in Okinawa who are very unhappy with American bases there. And so you find link-ups between Chinese student groups in Okinawa and the anti-basing people. And you notice when there are demonstrations against the bases, you know, get out of our bases kind of thing, that the Chinese student groups are marching with the Okinawa anti-base people. And I would love to find out if there are any financial contributions taking place there. And I'm sure the Japanese intelligence agencies are right on top of this, but they're not talking. So that's one issue. Another one is Chinese buying up large swaths of land in Japan. And one of them, which was revealed in a Japanese magazine called Sentaku, or Choice, pointed to a hostess bar in Yakojima run by a Chinese woman that served what they call dirt cheap drinks. And the idea is to invite the servicemen and business, I can see Toshi laughing here, to get the young hostesses, after they ply their clients with drinks, and they start asking them information which has nothing to do with the activities of Japanese hostesses in hostess bars. And so that's one thing. And another concerns Hokkaido, which is the least populated of the Japanese islands because it's cold up there. And the Chinese companies have been buying places there. And in one case, there was a large tract of land bought that was allowed to sit there fallow. In other words, they're not raising anything there. So what's the point? And in another one, a Chinese business bought this plot of land, and they said, well, we'll put a factory in there, which they did. And then they put a very big heliport in next to the factory. And we're not sure what that's supposed to be for either, but it arouses suspicion. And a third interest has been, quote, integrated resort activities. I didn't know what an integrated resort was until I read this, but it combines hotels and gambling and prostitution and all kinds of things like that. In other words, the usual sinful luxury amenities. But there are also concerns that these are going to be centers of espionage. And a few months ago, in fact, I think it was December, a Japanese Diet member was indicted on charges that the Chinese casino company had bribed him to push through the enabling legislation. So again, another concern. A third one, and all in geographically widely spaced places, Hokkaido, Miyakojima, Okinawa, their Chinese interests are buying up machiya in Kyoto. And these are these very old traditional homes that there really are very few of left in Japan. Kyoto was spared the bombing in World War II. So they're really a cultural heritage, and turning them into guest houses, high occupancy guest houses for low budget Chinese tourists. So also there are 3 times as many Chinese people moving to Japan as have been, and some of them are undoubtedly perfectly upstanding people who want to make a living, others may not be, and the concern is sorting one out from the other. Do I have time to go into the Japanese educational thing, or am I running out of time?
I think well, if we could just do a couple of them quickly, because we're getting into a lot of the methods here. So if you could just go quickly through a couple of other things that you see as key methods, and I want to throw it back to Toshi to see how this fits into what he sees as a broader pattern. So just
okay, well, let me do just 2 of them. And then the first one will be education. Chinese students are the largest group of international students in Japan. They are 38% of the total. That's big. And they mostly study STEM subjects, but there are growing concerns about espionage. And originally the idea is to know us is to love us. So Chinese students would study in Japan, and they would be very influenced by the Japanese way of life and the wonderful food and anime and manga. And Japan would make friends. And I talked to one Japanese educational, actually he's an official, and he sighed and he said, to know us is not necessarily to love us. So that part hasn't worked quite the way it should. And now Japan has 17 Confucius Institutes and 8 Confucius classrooms. The first group is at the university level. The other group is at various lower levels. And Sankei Shimbun, which is a center-right Japanese newspaper, asked the educational minister who exercised oversight over them, and his answer was no one. And obviously that concerns Sankei, and so, which commented that there's no scrutiny of the curricula to see whether controversial issues like World War II or the disputed Senkaku Diaoyu Tai Islands are covered. Now, again, we're sure Japanese intelligence agencies are watching these, but they've said nothing publicly, at least that they'll tell me. And the second issue, I decided to combine 3 into 1 here, Jacques. Cyber attacks, artificial intelligence, and fake news. Come on, they're kind of connected. And there's been a lot of concern with this. Recently, websites are attacked millions of times a year, and the Japanese government has refused to specify the source, despite the fact that many of them are adorned with little Chinese flags and simplified characters, meaning they come from China rather than Taiwan or Singapore or Hong Kong. Now, 2 major, a lot of these are just nuisance, but recently 2 major Japanese corporations who do defense-related work for the Japanese government revealed that they were hacked a couple of years before they went public with the information. And you're saying to yourself, why were they keeping quiet about this? Why didn't we know before? Now, recently, there's been a lot of concern in Japan with possible election meddling. And in December, a commission came up with a draft report that urges the private sector to avoid the problems seen in the elections in France and the United States, which the report said delicately had, quote, wielded an impact. I think this is traditional Japanese reticence to come out with what they're saying. And also the Japanese co-sponsored a workshop on disinformation with Taiwan. and also the US and Sweden, and it was held in Taipei in a kind of subtle thumbing of the nose at China. Fake news with regard to Okinawa. The Global Times, which is a Beijing newspaper, said in 2017 there had been a referendum in Okinawa in which 75% of the voters demanded independence and the recovery of free trade with China. To the best of my knowledge, there's never been free trade with China, but let's Global Times have that. And the other 25% preferred an autonomous Okinawa. In other words, amazingly, nobody was undecided or had other issues. And according to a Japanese intelligence agency source, such a referendum was never held. And there've also been rumblings in the Chinese press now and then about Okinawa not being part of Japan. Okay, so now in sum, Chinese political warfare in Japan has been active, but it's been much less successful than in the other democracies. Why? My hypothesis.
Juno, I want to bracket the sort of response bit for a little bit later in our discussion. So
okay,
hold that thought.
The conclusions to last. Makes sense.
That's where we put our conclusions. Yes, sometimes they go after last. We run out of time. Toshi, so June's given us an inventory of the many tools that China has used in the broad rubric of what we could call political warfare in Japan, which includes sort of almost fifth column type groups, right? That is either returnees or the Japan Communist Party at one point, exploiting issues that are divisive in Japan, be it Okinawa or nuclear weapons or nuclear powers, playing on those political divisions, using economic levers by offering incentives and opportunities or withholding them for Japanese companies, investing on the ground in Japan, which gives a footprint, sending in students who may or may not have agendas, Confucius institutes, which clearly do have agendas. And then the toolkit we've seen in political systems around the world through fake news and fronted news sources that are meant to either sow discord or spread false information or both. So that's a pretty elaborate toolkit. Is that pretty typical in the United Front work? Are there other things that are missing from that inventory? Are there tools in that repertoire that you see as more important or more effective than others? How about any of that? Toshi?
Yeah, so I think if you think about United Front work in terms of means, I would argue that it is almost invariably offensive in nature. United Front work is designed to infiltrate. It's designed to penetrate. It's designed to sort of get inside enemy lines, if you will, to begin to exert the CCP's influence in both direct and indirect way. So I would describe the means, the tools by which the CCP uses to do United Front work as invariably offensive in character. And in order to exert the CCP's influence, it needs vehicles. It needs carriers, essentially, of the CCP's message inside of the target foreign countries. And that will require the CCP to co-opt or buy off various individuals, preferably high-level individuals with political access. So they're typically targeting elites within foreign countries that have access to the corridors of power. That then gives the CCP an indirect avenue for influencing policy debates and policy decisions. What I found also in my research is that the CCP infiltrates into foreign countries through local fronts, through proxy organizations. And these are locally led organizations, meaning they are run by foreigners within that target foreign country. Again, typically individuals with a lot of access, a lot of influence, a big Rolodex, a lot of contacts that, again, allow the CCP to extend its influence. And all of this is supported by a very complex, sophisticated global propaganda machine, both in print and also online and also in social media. What I want to do is to just give you a snapshot of a mini case study of a United Front organization that actually does this work. The broad institution is the United Front Work Department. Now, this organization is formally responsible for doing United Front work. Now, one of the sub-organizations that answers to the United Front Work Department is this kind of a mouthful. It has a long title. It's called the China Council for the Promotion of Peaceful National Reunification. This is a United Front organ that is responsible to the United Front Work Department, and it has local chapters all around the world. These local chapters are composed basically of almost exclusively ethnic Chinese members of the local communities, led by frequently very respectable local leaders. And their job is to basically promote the one country, two systems model. They obviously use the freedoms afforded to civic organizations, right? That is a pillar of free societies, to have civic organizations. And they use that free space essentially to promote the CCP's policies related to Taiwan and in Hong Kong. I found evidence, for example, of a state-led media article claiming credit for the China Council on the mainland, directing these local chapters to support the defense of the torch relay, if you might remember, during the Beijing Olympics, in the run-up to the Beijing Olympics in 2008, where you had Chinese students and other folks from the local communities trying to harass, intimidate, and even attack the human rights protesters who were protesting the torch relay in countries such as Australia and even in Europe. And I found an article that literally took credit and lauded the China Council for actively supporting these local chapters. So here we have a really good example, and it was really in some ways an early warning of what United Front work was going to look like in foreign countries. And so I think we really do have to be aware that the various instruments that the CCP is using are to exploit essentially the open space afforded to free individuals in liberal democracies, and essentially weaponizing those very freedoms to turn them against the West, and also to do so in support of the CCP's objectives.
Okay, thanks. That's a terrific case study of some of the methods that you've seen in your work and that June has described somewhat in Japan. So that's the methods. And you touched a little bit in your last remarks on some of the aims. So China's got this elaborate apparatus, these many channels of trying to affect politics in Japan and in other target countries. Pretty elaborate process. June's described, an octopus-like structure with all sorts of tentacles. You've described an elaborate institutional structure and how it interacts with host country civil society organizations and so on. But to what ends is this apparatus put? As you both mentioned in your first responses, this has roots in an era of trying to promote communist parties coming to power. That's obviously not a feasible agenda, or probably even a very ardently pursued one, much of anywhere now. So it's going after other things. So Toshi, first to you. What is China trying to achieve through these methods? You've touched upon some of them, that is trying to promote Chinese views on particularly sensitive policy issues. Didn't want the Olympics boycotted, didn't want the Free Tibet agenda to get going, to overshadow what China wanted to do there, towing the line on Hong Kong, Taiwan. So what are the ends to which you see this apparatus being put, and how successful do you see it as being?
Yeah, so I think the starting point for understanding what the CCP wants is to really try to understand the CCP's ideological worldview. Now, while it is fashionable these days to argue that the CCP's leadership has basically exchanged Marxist-Leninist Maoist theory for unfettered capitalism and Jeffersonian principles, right? That's not the case. The leadership of the CCP are still deeply indoctrinated in their Leninist, Marxist-Leninist, Maoist worldview. And this worldview suggests that China is essentially surrounded by hostile ideological powers, particularly those in the West. And the leading and the most dangerous ideological power that represents values that are fundamentally antithetical to the CCP is the United States. The CCP views the United States as a as an ideological revolutionary power that is intent on exporting Western values into China, that of course would threaten the very body politic, the very survival of the CCP. And so therefore, if we accept, and I certainly do, and again, it's based on extensive CCP writings. They write about this. They are obsessed with this potential ideological danger in the external world. That there is a need, therefore, to harden the CCP shell against these ideological dangers. And the solution to this is to use United Front work. So I would say the first primary goal of the CCP is a defensive one. It's a strategically defensive one, which is the survival of the CCP within what it perceives as a very hostile ideological external environment. It is also strategically defensive to the extent that United Front work is designed to maintain the CCP's reputation, burnish the CCP's image overseas, and also to legitimize the CCP in the eyes of the West and various external constituents, as well as to legitimize many of the CCP's foreign policy objectives, such as the Belt and Road Initiative that seeks to link China to the rest of Eurasia through a vast infrastructure, financial, and communications network. So on the one hand, it is strategically defensive, but I would argue that the CCP also pursues strategically offensive means. By definition, what China is trying to do is pursue positive aims, right? Positive aims by definition is offensive because it's trying to change the status quo into something that's no longer the status quo. And by definition, that is offensive, right? It's designed to pursue a positive aim. And so what is the CCP trying to do? Well, the CCP is trying to use United Front work, to use political warfare to essentially change the hearts and minds of various audiences, both within China and abroad. And what it wants to do, I think its ultimate goal, is to get the West to basically, even if grudgingly, to ultimately come to terms with the authoritarian nature of the CCP. Because the CCP, again, because of its ideological worldview, believes that the West is fundamentally uncomfortable with the very authoritarian nature of the regime. So its positive aim is to change the hearts and minds and the behavior of the governments of the West in ways that accommodates not only the CCP's interests, but also accommodates the CCP's very values. And so I would argue that what CCP is trying to do is both defensive and offensive in character.
Forget to demute sometimes. All right. So, and it's an interesting picture of, in a sense, mirroring, right? The belief is the West is trying to change China, the US knows they're trying to change China. So it's essentially Western United Front work that we're trying to get it. So this is a tit for tat kind of strategy, and an outward looking strategy that says basically make the world safe for autocracy. So there's some interesting mirror imaging there. So I want to throw it back to June in a moment, but there's a question that came into the chat box to Toshi that I think I'll raise at this point, which is, could you give a concrete example of what you see as United Front work targeting the Western Hemisphere, the US or others, particularly specific institutions or organizations? I mean, June gave us a list of some of the identifiable targets in Japan. Can you give an example of what you see as typical or serious in terms of the United Front work in the US or elsewhere?
Sure. If you don't mind, I'm going to kind of make this a bit transatlantic. I'm gonna add some examples from Europe as well. And one of the case studies that I've been looking at is the emergence of local proxy groups under the rubric of friendship groups. These are usually, again, led by local foreign nationals, foreign elites working within their own countries, leading friendship groups that have linkages to China. So you'll have, say, the EU-China friendship group in Europe that is presumably designed to promote EU-China friendship. But I would consider them basically proxy organizations. Again, the pattern is very familiar. They exploit the freedoms afforded to civic societies to stand up these local friendship groups. The leaders typically, again, if you follow their pronouncements, they always toe the CCP's line when it comes to the CCP's policies, from human rights in Tibet and Xinjiang all the way to China's policies in the South China Sea. You have these friendship groups that are located all across the West, including the United States. Another kind of United Front-like work are friendship city or sister city agreements that are run by the, again, an association based in China on the promotion of friendly relations. It has a really long title. And what's interesting about this association is that it was actually mentioned by Secretary of State Pompeo in a recent speech that he made to the National Governors Association about the dangers of this association trying to link up with the various state and local level officials to try to gain access, market access, investments in pension funds, investments in sensitive technologies. But to go back to these friendship city agreements, these are again presumably designed to promote city to city relations, but frequently these fronts, if you will, are used to promote the CCP's agenda. So I think we'll talk about this a little bit later, but in the midst of the COVID crisis, what we've seen is that these sister city agreements, these groups, have been actively promoting the supply of masks and other PPE to the local communities. I think as a way, essentially, to show that China is actively supporting foreign countries in fighting COVID, but also as a way to, in some ways, distract these communities from the fact that COVID started in China. So this is happening right now as we speak, both in Europe and in the Western Hemisphere. And it's, what is really fascinating in my view is that they're patently transparent about this. Many of these local chapters have websites that you can go and check out. Now, many of them are more transparent in the Chinese language, but they nevertheless tell us a lot about what they do and what they're trying to do.
Okay, thanks. So let's turn this back to June now. We have a question from the audience about why essentially one should be so suspicious of the Chinese investment in Japan that you point to. After all, China has now become a big source of FDI pretty much around the world, and it's sitting on piles of cash from trade surpluses with various countries, has to be recycled somewhat. So how do we disentangle what is suspicious investment from essentially economic-oriented investment? You got to recycle the foreign exchange somehow.
Well, first of all, I noticed that the person said that Japan had a long-term trade deficit with China. That's not true. And furthermore, these things go back and forth, but the two countries have different ways of assessing their trade promotions. So if China says, we have a trade deficit with you, it's your fault, and they say it doesn't, it looks like it the other way around, but in fact, Japanese corporations have set up in China, and the Chinese profit from these trade organizations is actually very small. You repatriate the money, and sometimes they include Hong Kong in the trade deficit and sometimes not. So it's very difficult to disentangle it, and you can't say whether one side is reporting more accurately than the other in this case because it's a different accounting system. Now, as for why worry about this, because if there is a trade deficit, it's not the fact that there is investment. Nobody worries, for example, about British investment in the United States. That's not the issue and never has been. And to say so is merely trying to obfuscate the issue. The issue is what it's used for. So if you buy a large plot of land, in this case, Japan, and don't do anything with it, then why have you bought it in the first place? Or if you buy a plot of land and set up a factory but then set up a heliport in it. What is the point of that? So the answer is you have to be suspicious of this. It is not the investment per se, it is the intent that the investment is being made for. And in this case, there are genuine suspicions for good reasons. You don't buy a huge plot of land to let it sit, for example.
Just to respond a bit to that.
Jacques, one more thing.
Sure.
There was the attempt to buy a large plot of land in, I believe it was Iceland, in order to put a golf course on it. You can't play golf there for most of the year. And it just happened to sit on a strategic waterway. So go ahead, Jacques. Sorry.
As I say, that just to expand on that a little bit and to address somewhat obliquely another question that came in the chat box. And this is one of the real issues of dealing with the not obviously state actors in China, to disentangle what is a commercial venture from something that has more of a political bent behind it, what is a purely social undertaking from things that have some of this quality. And it's a genuinely tough policy problem. So formally, in some sense, the Confucius Institutes are like the Alliance Française or the Goethe Institute, but nobody really buys that because you trace the agenda, what they're attempting to do, and their links to the Hanban, the government, quasi-governmental agencies overseas, and they're clearly a different kettle of fish. And if you look at foreign investment coming into the US, Japan, and other places, to take the US example, the CFIUS process, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, scrutinizes Chinese investments more than any other. That's partly a matter of scale, but it's also partly a matter of what June is talking about, which is buying things that seem to be located next to strategic bases, investing in technologically sensitive enterprises, things like that. And sometimes that's the why, sometimes the who. Who is up the chain from the investor? Does it seem to be a state-linked entity? But these are genuinely tough, and sometimes they do seem to go a little crazy. Was buying an American chain of movie theaters really a serious threat? But for those who want to get into specific examples of methods that are used in the US and for that matter Australia, I urge you to turn into tomorrow's session when we'll be talking about my piece and Michael Clark's piece, which go into some examples of how Chinese political warfare efforts have targeted specific institutions and actors in the United States. Looking what else is coming on the chat box here. All right, while I peruse that, okay, so if I can throw this back to Toshi for a moment, someone has asked about something else that's prominently featured in your article, which is the internal workings of the United Front Work Department. How does it set its priorities? How does it manage itself? So some of the sort of institutional story that figures prominently in your article. If I can throw that to you for a couple minutes to address that while I sort out where we go next.
Sure. So, what is important to note is that the United Front Work Department is really just one part of a much larger tapestry of United Front institutions. And what is really interesting to note is that the whole system was revitalized under Xi Jinping back in 2015, because there was a sense that the CCP cadre were no longer really interested in United Front work. Many of the cadre were busy, going out earning money, and they thought that United Front work was second line work and was a distraction from some of the things that they needed to do. And so what Xi Jinping sought to do was to revitalize the system to make it a front line, a first line work for the CCP. And so he essentially formed what we would consider an interagency system, centralizing United Front work under a leading small group that focuses exclusively on United Front. And the United Front Work Department and other party state organs are part of this interagency process. And again, the CCP is surprisingly transparent about, what are the working relationships, who are represented in these interagency meetings. Within the United Front Work Department, there are multiple bureaus that are specifically focused on groups that they're focused on. So there's a bureau on ethnic minorities. There is a bureau on religious groups within China. And so if you study essentially the bureaucratic character of United Front work, you get a good sense of the scope of their operations. Now, I think I would just add that the part of the reason that the United Front work has gone global is because of the globalization of Chinese interests. So increasingly, you have a much larger number of Chinese studying overseas. And again, if you believe in the CCP's ideological worldview, their main fear is that these returning students are going to bring back those ideological toxins or poisons back into China. And so therefore, not only do they need to inoculate the CCP from those potential re-importing of these ideological toxins, but that increasingly the CCP needs to go out, it needs to go global to monitor and control Chinese studying overseas. And this is where you see the nexus between China's defensive and offensive aims, right? That it's trying to protect itself, and the only way to do so is to go abroad and to seek to control events. And so I think there you see that pattern of behavior where, the bumper sticker might be, the best defense is a good offense.
There's the follow-up question from one of our audience about specifically the mechanisms for coordination with the foreign ministry and therefore China's embassies abroad, the Ministry of State Security. Which parts of the state apparatus are most vital to United Front work, and what's the mechanism for that coordination?
I must confess that this is the actual mechanisms are still a bit of a mystery to me, but we do know, for example, that the Chinese Scholars and Students Association that have been very active on Western university campuses have received funding from the local embassies and local consulates. And we also do know that United Front cadre and operatives often operate under the cover of the foreign ministry through the embassies in order to operate on foreign territories. And so this is one of the things that is so important about disentangling and unpacking the bureaucracies in the institutions, because that's really the only way to understand how this operates. And so we shouldn't, for example, focus only on what the United Front Work Department is doing. We really need to understand the network, the universe of party state organs. Some of them are formally assigned to United Front work, others are not, but they do United Front-like activities. And to me, their work is just as important as the work being done by the United Front Work Department.
Thanks. Lest June think I have forgotten, I have not. I'm going to throw it back to her now to address the final question that I want to pose to both of you, which is what's the response? How does one handle these kinds of threats and challenges? So June had described Japan as being relatively successful. So what has Japan done right, and what has it not done right that it should do better? Set of June, and then we'll close it out by throwing it back to Toshi for his prescriptions for how Western democracies more generally can deal with the threat. June?
Well, I think Japan initially was very vigilant, but it discovered in the process of dealing with a China that wanted to dictate its foreign policies that there were certain things it really needed to do. For example, you brought up CFIUS before, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. The Japanese did not have an equivalent of CFIUS. They saw what was happening. They have passed legislation to do that. With regard to the concerns about espionage by Chinese students in Japan, they are having the same kind of problems that the United States has. Universities do not want to participate in any kind of scrutiny of their students. So what the Japanese government has done, and this is not yet passed, but it's being seriously discussed, is the subsidies that the Japanese government gives to Japanese universities are going to be... Somebody is trying to speak.
I need to mute. Okay, go ahead.
The Japanese government is considering tying the subsidies that it gives to Japanese universities by how cooperative they are in assisting in the scrutinization process. And again, I can promise you the Okinawa problem is being very carefully looked at. But again, as I mentioned, the real success of Japan there is something that Japan is usually criticized for. in that it has not historically been an inclusive society. And that makes us very different from the other democracies we're considering, because in the case of the United States, almost all of us came from somewhere else at some point or other. And the same is true of European democracies, because willy-nilly, because the invasions of going back and forth for thousands of years of Franks and Gauls and Angles and Romans and Magyars and what have you, mean our DNA gets very mixed up. And our cultures are also much more intertwined, whereas Japanese culture is very unique and very attractive for that reason, but it's also been a defense for Japan. And so I would argue that my conclusion from this is that lack of inclusiveness can coexist with being a democracy. And I think really what we have here is, in the land of the rising sun, we have democracy with Japanese characteristics, and it's been much more resistant to infiltration by United Front tactics than the other kind of Western democracy.
Well, thanks, June. So, Toshi, that's kind of a bleak prescription almost, right? That is, if it depends on Japanese culture and political culture, well, it's going to be hard for the U.S. to pull that one off. So what can those of us who are not blessed with Japanese culture do to defend against the efforts of United Front work and political warfare from China?
So, just as the CCP pursues defensive aims, offensive aims, and uses defensive and offensive tactics, I think we also, in our counter strategy in the West, need to be thinking in defensive and offensive terms. So firstly, I think from a defensive perspective, the first is simply awareness. Just being aware that many of these activities are taking place below the radar screen, and that they are using, again, weaponizing our freedoms and turning them against the West. So we need to be able to expose these activities, to expose the individuals, to expose the organizations, but also to be able to actively counter the disinformation effort that's being pumped out by these various groups. And so we have a very powerful weapon on our side, in my view, and that's simply the truth. To be able to use truth to counter the mistruths and the campaigns to deceive and to confuse. I would also argue that it's not just, and I would also say that part of this awareness is the fact that it is being reflected in our policy documents, whether it's in the National Security Strategy, the National Defense Strategy, the Indo-Pacific Strategy that just came out by the Pentagon, or by the Defense Intelligence Agency's report on Chinese military. They're all now using language like political warfare. And that's a great way of raising awareness of this and to sort of energize government institutions to do their work. Now, we also need to go on the offense. And that means we need to seek to impose costs on the CCP in an effort to deter them, so that when they do consider political warfare options, they'll at least at a minimum think twice because of the possible consequences of the West's response. That might include identifying corrupt officials, for example, to really try to impose reputational costs, political costs, legitimacy costs on the regime. Perhaps there are ways we can get behind the Great Firewall. There are many Chinese people who also yearn for the truth, and the West should be ready to be able to provide that truth. And finally, I think what we need is a comprehensive strategy, meaning it's not just tit-for-tat responses in the area of political warfare. We need to integrate our national strategy so that we're pushing back economically, we're pushing back diplomatically, militarily, and in the ideational front in a comprehensive, integrated manner. And I think we're beginning to see that with this administration in the past 2 years.
Thank you so much. And boy, right at 12:30, Toshi, that's very impressive. So we started a couple minutes late. We have just enough time to stay within our hour, but throwing it back to Raleigh to send us out. But before I do that, I just want to say thank you, June, and thank you, Toshi. It's a terrifically rich discussion. I very much appreciate it. And I urge you all to tune in tomorrow for our final installment, which will be a bit of a hybrid, since my panelists there are mostly in Australia, and we're not going to make them be up at 1:30 in the morning. So we'll record the discussion part, but we will have a live Q&A. So thank you both. Thank you all for joining us today. And now back to Raleigh.
Just to reiterate what Jacques said, thank you, Jacques. June, and Toshi. That was fascinating. And a reminder that if you missed any of our events earlier this week, they're on the FPRI YouTube channel. And we'll be back here tomorrow at 11:30 for the next installment. I'd also like to say thank you to our supporters and members, and a reminder again, if you don't get Orbis, you can get that through your membership. If you're not getting it now, you just add $50 onto your membership and you will become a subscriber to Orbis. Thank you again, and hope to see you tomorrow, and in the meantime, stay safe. All best.